Hello everyone and welcome back to the Airfix YouTube channel for another how-to video. This time we're going to be building and painting the 1/72nd scale RNLI Shannon class lifeboat. The Shannon class is the lifeboat currently in operation today around the British Isles. These lifeboats are supported fully by charitable donations, and at least 90 pence from the sale of each kit will be given to the RNLI to keep these lifeboats operational. Because this is a starter set, as well as the model kit, you also get Humbrol polycement, some paintbrushes and some acrylic paints to paint the kit. So other than a few tools, everything you need for a basic build is in the box. On the back of the box you'll find the usual full colour diagrams with colour callouts for the acrylic paints supplied. Each little box with a paintbrush icon calls out a different number to tell you which colour to paint that part. The smaller red boxes relate to the numbers on the included transfer sheet, and the diagrams will help with placement. Inside the box you'll find a large bag containing all of the frames holding the model pieces and a smaller bag holding the clear frame for the windows. In the smaller bag you'll find Humbrol polycement and 6 acrylic paints. The 2 brushes supplied are a number 0 and a number 4, the larger one being for the larger areas and the smaller one for any fine detail painting. The included transfer contains all of the markings for the lifeboat, as well as some of the more complex coloured areas which would be too difficult to paint. The instruction guide details the build step by step, with colour callouts for each component and all of the part numbers. It's important to read this before you start, as there are some areas that will be inaccessible later on in the project. There's also the Before You Start guide, which details the common tools and techniques for model building. We'll be carrying out item 1, which is to wash all of the parts with warm soapy water before we begin this video. Our basic toolkit consists of a pair of cutters for snipping parts away from the frame, a modelling knife for removing any excess plastic and general cutting, a modelling file for removing any plastic left behind by the connection points to enable a perfect fit, and a pair of tweezers to assist with applying the markings. We're also going to be priming this kit using Humbrol's acrylic spray primer. We're lucky enough to have extraction here on the workbench, but if you're using it at home, make sure that you read all of the warnings on the back of the can before you start spraying. We've got some cardboard down on the bench to protect it from overspray, and the frames have been washed and allowed to dry fully, so now we can start spraying the Humbrol acrylic spray primer over the entirety of the frames. Each frame is given light coats of the primer, and it's turned, enabling the spray to get into all of the different nooks and crannies, giving us good even coverage over all of the parts. The primer is built up in light layers, rather than trying to spray one heavy, solid layer which might run or sag on the surface of the model. By building the primer up gradually, we're able to get a really nice, smooth, matte surface which is perfect for painting over with acrylic paints, as it takes away most of the surface tension issues you'd expect when painting over bare plastic. We can now start the actual construction with the base. This needs to be painted with number 15, which is midnight blue, and the first component we'll need is part number A1. This can be identified using the part numbers moulded into the small tabs next to each part on the frame. Now that we've identified the part we need, we can use the cutters to cut the connection points between the part and the frame. We do this a short way away from the surface of the model part, so that the cutters don't cause any damage on the visible surface. This leaves behind a small protrusion of excess plastic which can be trimmed away flush with the surface using the modelling knife. We can then switch to the file to finish the job and remove all traces of the connection point. Once these have been removed completely, we can go ahead and assemble the base using the supplied polycement. This glue works by melting the plastic of the model kit together so it forms a permanent join. It's also capable of damaging the model kit, so we're going to use small amounts and we're going to keep it under tight control. We'll apply the polycement only to the areas marked yellow in the instruction manual. In this case, it's the locating tabs moulded into the underside of the part. Once the glue has been applied, we'll guide the locating tabs carefully into the receiving holes on the main body of the base, push the part into position and hold it for a few seconds while the glue does its work. We're going to be using the number 15 paint supplied with the kit to paint the base, and the first thing we're going to do is give it a good stir to restore its consistency, as the paints can separate while the kits are in storage. After stirring, we'll transfer some of the number 15 into our palette, and then we'll add 3 or 4 drops of ordinary tap water to thin the paint. This prolongs the drying time and allows it to self-level on the surface of the model, giving a much smoother finish. It does reduce the opacity of the paint, meaning we'll have to build up colour coverage in multiple thin layers, but the resultant smoother finish is worth the extra effort. We're using the larger number 4 brush supplied with the kit to paint this part of the model, as it is quite large. After applying the initial coat of paint, it's allowed to dry fully, and then we can add another layer over the top to solidify the colour and build up coverage until everything's perfect. While that paint's drying, we can move on to the assembly of the hull. The cleanup procedure is the same as we showed on the base, with the frame being snipped away with the cutters, and then the knife and file used to remove any traces of the connection points. This is essential as these are on mating surfaces, so any excess plastic would interfere with the fit of the parts. After cleanup, we can commence a process known as dry fitting, where parts are placed together without any glue to ensure that they fit perfectly. We're dry fitting the spacers on the hull to make sure that they go into position correctly and that we've removed all traces of connection point. Once that's complete, we can apply polycement in line with the yellow area in the instructions and glue the first of the spacers into position. The second spacer is added in the same fashion, and once it's in position, we carry out another dry fit to make sure that the two halves of the hull are going to go together properly. After checking that the spacers are lined up with the locating slots, we can go ahead and start applying the polycement to carry out the hull join. The glue is added as per the yellow areas in the instructions, but when we add the polycement, it's concentrated along the inside edge of the joining faces. This makes sure that when the two halves of the hull are pressed together, any excess glue will bubble out onto the inside of the hull and not outwards onto the visible surface of the model. This keeps the join as clean as possible. After allowing the hull join to cure for a few minutes, we can complete this part of the assembly by adding the back panel. We're using the same technique with the glue concentrated towards the inside of the hull, so any excess won't be visible. After cleaning up the upper deck, we can add polycement to the large locating tab which runs around the perimeter of this part, and then press it into position on the now fully cured lower hull, completing this part of the assembly stage. With the glue fully cured on the lower hull, we can move on to painting. We're using the number 15 paint supplied with the kit, and it's being prepared in exactly the same fashion as we showed earlier in the video, with a few drops of tap water to thin it down, using the number 4 brush to apply. We're applying this number 15 paint in all of the areas shown in the diagrams on the rear of the box. If you do have access to bigger brushes, such as these Humbrol flat brushes, this can speed up painting large areas quite a lot, as the larger flat brush holds more paint and applies it in a much more even brush pattern, allowing you to quickly cover large areas and giving the paint more chance of settling down to a smoother finish. But for the purposes of this video, we're going to stick with the number 4 brush supplied with the kit, and after the initial coat is dry, we'll add some more of the number 15 and build up our colour coverage until we've got a nice solid coat of the midnight blue paint. Next, we need to paint the deck with number 27, so we'll dilute this with a few drops of water as normal, and then go ahead and start at the rear of the vessel, where we need to get a nice crisp demarcation line between the grey of the deck and the blue of the hull. By pressing the brush flat against the deck and then pushing it outwards over the join, we can get a nice crisp line between the two different colours. The rest of the process is simply blocking in this area with the diluted 27 and then allowing it to dry fully before applying a second coat to build up the colour coverage. Next, we're going to use the number 33 supplied with the kit to paint the fender around the upper hull. We'll thin the paint with water as usual, but this time we'll use the size 0 brush to paint in the demarcation lines between the previously painted areas, as this smaller brush will give better control. Once this is done, we can switch back to the size 4 and block in the area in between to completely paint the fender with number 33 matte black. Now we need to turn our attention to the lower hull, where there's another demarcation line, this time running down the centre line of the boat. This is quite tricky to paint in, so we need to work our way carefully towards it from the bottom upwards, as we can always add more of the black paint, but it's very difficult to paint over it because it's obviously such a dark colour. So we gradually encroach onto the blue until the black paint is where it needs to be, and then we can block in underneath. Once the front portion is done, we'll start again at the other end and we'll try to meet halfway, again starting down low and then working our way upwards. Once one side is complete and the demarcation line is where we want it to be, we can turn the model onto its back and use that line as a reference to paint in a symmetrical demarcation line on the other side. With the lower hull completely painted, our attention shifts to the cabin on the upper deck. This is being painted with the number 18 supplied with the kit that's been thinned down with a bit of tap water. You'll notice that these parts are being painted while they're still attached to the frame. This just keeps everything organised during the painting process and also assists in handling of the parts. Because the orange is such a bright colour, it'll take numerous coats of paint to build up good coverage over the dull grey primer. Because of the additional tap water, we can do this without worrying about the surface detail being obliterated by a heavy coat of paint. Once all of the smaller components are painted, we can then move on to the single piece cabin housing that drops onto the upper deck and build up a good coverage of orange paint using multiple thin layers. If you do have access to larger brushes, a big component such as this is a really good place to use them, as it can cut down the painting time considerably. The numerous layers have been added. We've got a lovely solid orange covering on all of our cabin components, and we can go ahead and start the assembly process. When parts have been painted on the frame, the cleanup process will obviously remove some of the paint. If this is in a visible area, then we'll need to do a touch-up using some of the orange paint left in the palette. If it's on one of the mating surfaces, we can leave it free of paint. The side of the wheelhouse is added first, using a small amount of polycement and guided very carefully into position, as we don't want to get any of the glue on our painted surfaces. The lower portion of the wheelhouse is then glued into position and held for a few seconds whilst dry, and then the whole assembly is glued into the back of the cabin. Once this is in position and held firmly, we can go ahead and apply the detail plates to the inside of the cabin, which plug up the holes in the side of the cabin assembly. For applying polycement and dropping the plates into position, we can then go ahead and add a few small spots of glue to the roof of the cabin, and then get the single clear window piece out of its own bag, fold it gently so that it fits in between the sides of the cabin walls, and drop it into position. The windows will click outwards into the opening when it's in the correct place, and with that the cabin assembly is complete and we can glue this onto the deck. To give us more control over the polycement whilst working around all these painted components, we're going to cut a small piece of the kit box away and then cut a small triangle from that. The larger piece will form a pallet onto which we can lay down our polycement, and the small triangle will be used as an applicator, which we can use to transfer the polycement carefully into detailed areas on the model, in this case the locating holes for the cabin assembly. Once the polycement is in place, we can line up the locating tabs on the bottom of the cabin with the holes on the deck, and then push this whole assembly down to glue it into position. With the main assemblies completed, it's time to move on to the detailing stage. We're going to leave these small parts attached to the frame for painting, but we'll clean them up as much as possible first. The paints used are called out in the instructions, and we'll paint all of the details in one go before we start to remove them from the frames, as this keeps everything nice and organised and assists in handling. When it's time to assemble the details, we'll snip them from the frame, carry out any cleanup that's necessary of the connection point, and then touch up the exposed plastic with the relevant colours. The palette and applicator setup comes in very handy at this point for applying small amounts of glue in tight areas, and we can start gluing the details to the model. There are various small details around this kit, including on the upper deck, and there are also handrails and handholds all over the place which need guiding into position. The smaller ones are relatively straightforward as they drop into their locating holes quite easily, but some of the handrails have got quite a bit of flex in them, so you need to carefully guide these into position, making sure that they don't spring out, bringing the glue with them out onto the painted surfaces. The guardrails which run down the sides of the upper deck are a perfect example of this, as their thin, detailed nature makes them very flexible. Therefore, it's best to put the polycement inside the locating hole and then push the guardrail down into this, as this will leave a nice clean finish, whereas if the glue was added to the guardrail itself, it would spread the glue all over your painted model. There's a small windscreen to add just in front of the wheelhouse, and once that's in position, we can start to work on the antennas. The detail parts for the main mast assembly are left attached to the frame, but as much excess plastic as possible is trimmed away to give better access for painting whilst still leaving them attached to the frame. Connection points are cleaned away, and then we can commence the painting stages. Using the colour callouts in the instructions, we'll start with the white areas first, as this colour is the easiest to cover up. Once the white areas are painted, we can switch to the matte black and paint in any areas which require this colour. This is mainly on the thin legs which support the mast. There are also some dark grey areas on some of the components, and we'll paint these in while it's all attached to the frame before assembling the main mast assembly and dropping it into position in the locating holes on the wheelhouse. Once the main mast has been added, the last few components are small thin antennas which are added to the locating holes on the upper portion of the cabin using the palette and applicator setup to carefully apply polycement. Once these antennas are in position, that completes the assembly portion of this build, and we can move on to the last stage, which is the application of the transfers. To apply the transfers to the model, we first need to cut the required marking away from the sheet using the modelling knife. This is then immersed in ordinary tap water for a few seconds before being set aside to soak for about a minute or two. This will loosen the adhesive between the transfer and the backing sheet, allowing it to move with gentle pressure from the paintbrush when it's ready to apply. We can then use the tweezers to hold the sheet in position while we slide the marking into place on the surface. Don't worry if it's not in exactly the right place to begin with, as that extra water on the model will allow it to be moved with the back of a modelling knife or with the paintbrush. This is the last stage in the build, so we'll go around the model applying all of the transfers into all of the areas called out on the back of the box. You can either leave them to dry or you can wick away the extra moisture using some tissue, but once all of the markings have been applied, that completes the build of the Airfix 1/72 scale RNLI Shannon class lifeboat. The combination of the bravery of the RNLI crew and the sleek cutting-edge design of these lifeboats makes this an alluring proposition for someone looking for a model in the maritime arena as they're getting into the hobby. If this model wasn't in a starter set format, it would pose quite a daunting proposition, but because of Airfix's reduced parts count and improved build sequence in the starter set format, this model is well within reach of even the most beginner modeler, so if you're looking for an interesting and exciting subject to build for your first model, then why not give the Shannon class lifeboat a try? Thank you very much for joining us for some modelling today, and we hope to see you again in the future.